Hey guys, in this video we're going to take a look at how to develop your very own HACCP plan. HACCP, of course, stands for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. And let's get started. So we have 7 principles of the HACCP plan. And first of all, that's to identify hazards and assess their severity and risks. So these hazards are those elements of either physical, chemical, or biological nature, as we've mentioned before, that can interfere with your food and make them unsafe. Then we want to identify the critical control points, or where in that food flow process are points where loss of control could result in a health risk. So that could be where an individual that is working for you is losing control of the critical control point, or it could be an area where you want to make sure that when items are being stored in the storage process, for instance, that they're being stored away from something which may be toxic. And establish those critical limits, so especially when it comes to temperature and time with your foods. Then we want to establish procedures to monitor critical control points, establish the corrective action to be taken in the event that control would be lost, establish effective record-keeping systems. So for instance, if we have shellfish or otherwise, we're going to want to make sure that we hold those tags for the required minimum of days, sometimes 60 days, 90 days, sometimes 6 months, depending on your local regulatory body. And then also to establish procedures to verify that the system is working, so we can make sure that all of our food is remaining safe. Just want to make one other point here as well too. When we talk about establishing critical limits, which include our time and temperature abuse standards, remember that we have our temperature danger zone, which is 41 to 135, and then we also have time and temperature safety standards for those items which are going to be cooled down or reheated, right? So we want to get from the 140 to 71 degrees in the first 2 hours, and then 72 to 41 in the next 2 thereafter. So we work on this 4-hour limit is generally how it works. Now, we saw this before. This is how our food moves through the food flow from receiving all the way on down to either reheating, serving, wherever the last end step is. And we see here, for the purposes of a HACCP plan, we've gone in and added our temperatures to be more specific. We've also included some steps on things where there might be a critical control point to inspect all deliveries, accept deliveries based on specification. So there may be specifications in another document for each particular item that comes in. We see again any point where temperature is of importance. We've been sure to note that. So therein the foods being higher than the temperature danger zone from 41 to 135. A lot of times, as mentioned in that last slide, when we look at regulating temperatures or putting them for hazard analysis critical control point, we want to fudge that by 5 degrees and say 140 degrees just to be extra safe, especially if we're on a steam table where that item might be coming into contact with the general air or flow, or it may be taking it a little bit different in temperature than the unit may say the temperature is. So again, we've noted there where all the critical control points are. Not all of them, of course, are noted, but as it goes through that flow, we've noted that and the temperature. Here's an example of one step in the process of a hazard analysis critical control point. So you can see it goes through the different steps from process, hazards, preventative measures and critical limits, monitoring process, corrective action, records, and finally verification. So first of all, we look and we see that we have, okay, at the receiving step, so this is just one step, you're going to be creating one of these and you want to include one of the steps. So for instance, you could do receiving here as one step, and they've noted that at this particular point there is a critical control point because the food could go out of temperature or otherwise. Then we have our hazards, right? So they could be physical, biological, or chemical, and so we've listed that there. So think about, if you have a particular item, let's say it's a dry storage item, well, they may be more susceptible to a physical contamination than, say, a bacterial contamination or a chemical contamination. Though, if you have chemicals being stored in the same spot as your dry storage, you might want to ensure that it's noted for chemical and that there is a step there saying, as a critical limit or preventive measure, not to put the food in the dry storage near chemicals and have those separately. So that's the next step, is preventive measures and critical limits. We see here a lot of things about specific temperatures and that the packaging is intact, and otherwise at the receiving step, of course, if we got in a package of fresh fish, and all of the ice was melted, we might be concerned, and therefore the packing is not intact as it notes there. Monitoring process is pretty straightforward. You can read through that. Corrective action then, here it notes very specific actions. So let's say in the event that we had that fish package come in and the ice had all melted, well, what are we going to do? We're going to reject that product that does not meet standards established by specification for whatever reason and send it back. Then we want to make sure that we have some form of receiving record. So if that's including invoices or otherwise in a systemic fashion, how are you going to do that? Well, here standard receiving is appropriate, but you want to make sure that in the case of things like shellfish or otherwise that may have other regulations, for instance, shellfish may say that you need to keep the tag from that particular box of oysters for 60 days, 90 days, or 6 months, depending on your jurisdiction. Finally, then, the verification step as well, supervisor to review receiving records on a weekly basis. So what is the best process for ensuring that those particular steps as listed in the previous 5 elements are being followed on a regular basis, right? So that might include checking that the invoices are in the proper format or checking in on individuals at that receiving step. Now's your chance to create your very own hazard plan. So just like the one that we saw in that previous slide right there, you want to create an Excel or a Word document which just looks just like that. And you want to identify a recipe item. So right on the top, you want to put the name of that item. So maybe right up here where it says hazard plan, you put hazard plan 4 and the name of your recipe item. And you can just, make up any recipe item for now. Later you'll be creating a menu in the weeks to come. But just pick a name, so maybe like a mac and cheese. Now identify at least 2 items which are either potentially hazardous or are temperature controlled for safety foods. And you want to make sure you pick an item then, a recipe item which has at least 2 items. So mac and cheese, maybe cheese because it's a dairy element, but that the pasta is likely not to be. So maybe we need to consider another element that is in the mac and cheese, whether we're making that by scratch and maybe there's milk or butter, which is dairy, or if you want to add an additional ingredient to it, tofu because it's soy, is a potentially hazardous or time control for safety food. And so you want to make sure you acknowledge that. So what then you're going to do is choose a step in the flow of food. Recall all the way back here where we have receiving, pre-preparation, which is kind of like storage, preparation, holding, serving, or reheating, and so on and so forth. Choose one of those steps, create your graph just like so, and then establish a HACCP plan for that step. So include the process step, the hazards, the preventive measures, monitoring process, corrective action, records, and verification unique to that particular item. So put the name of that item up here. You'll put the ingredients, maybe list them under 2 different rows, and then acknowledge, is it a critical control point, or is it you might also want to notice there whether it's a potentially hazardous food or a temperature control for safety food. And then go through the analysis. Is it susceptible to bacterial physical contamination? So maybe if we did the cheese and we did the pasta may not be a critical control point, nor may it be a physical or a PHF food or a TCS food. So you want to go through and still do the analysis. Okay, so it's maybe in dry storage, but it still may be prone to, say, chemical contamination if you don't have the chemicals in the right spot in your restaurant, or other physical contamination as well. And then go through each of the steps as listed here, again for at least 2 ingredients in that one recipe. Okay, and once you've done all of that, then we just want a small little kind of reflection paragraph. So below the HACCP chart, include a minimum of 200 words, which explains why the item is PHF or TCS, and why also more holistically it's important to be monitored at this point in the food flow process. And if you want to throw in an extra bit or 2 about what you learned about controlling food service and sanitation, that might get you an extra few points as well. So that's food service sanitation in a very short nutshell. You may be taking a class later on ServSafe with the National Restaurant Association show, so leave a lot of the more gritty details to that or another class on food service sanitation. But there's just the big picture overview of food service sanitation for food service venues. Next up, we're going to take a look at creating your very own menu, and then on to the steps of receiving and storage and how we create the systems within the restaurant for those steps as well.